Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
A little girl sits alone on the streets of Incheon after an offensive attack against the North Korean forces in the city in 1950. She cries amidst the chaos left by the battle, part of the surprise offensive by the UN forces that reclaimed the city. During the conflict, about 100,000 children were orphaned, many living on the streets and relying on soldiers and international organizations to survive. A soldier trying to comfort his infantry companion after a day of battle. The photo was taken in the mountains of Korea in 1951. You can feel the weight of the moment as the soldier offers emotional support after losing many comrades in combat. Meanwhile, in the background, another soldier takes on a difficult and painful task, filling out the identification tags of the fallen. This had to be done to ensure that each fallen soldier was properly recorded. Two boys who served in the North Korean army are captured by U.S. forces. Child soldiers like these boys were often forced to fight, frequently without any choice, amid the chaos of the conflict. It is estimated that more than 50,000 children were recruited for the war effort, a practice that had devastating consequences for such young lives. U.S. Marines head toward Incheon as the battle unfolds in the background in 1950. The invasion of Incheon was one of the most important operations led by UN forces to retake the city from the North Koreans. The amphibious attack surprised the enemy, as Incheon was considered a difficult target due to its extreme tides and heavily defended shores. Even so, the operation was a success and became a turning point in the Korean War. Here we see American soldiers on alert atop a vehicle camouflaged with straw at a command post in South Korea on July 12, 1950. In the early days, American forces faced the rapid advance of North Korean troops. The use of camouflage, such as straw and local vegetation, was a common technique to protect from enemy attacks, especially in a war where mobility and strategic positioning were essential for the success of operations. Lieutenant Colonel Francis S. Gabreski in his fighter plane, decorated with Nazi emblems representing his 28 aerial victories in World War II. Known as the greatest American aviation ace in that conflict, he piloted the iconic Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. After his impressive career in World War II, Gabreski also excelled in the Korean War, becoming one of the few pilots to achieve ace status in two conflicts, solidifying his legend in U.S. military aviation. Here, we see South Korean women crying as they listen to President Syngman Rhee during a memorial service in Seoul on October 17, 1953. The event honored the 33,964 South Koreans who lost their lives in the last year of the war. Although the armistice had been signed in July, the scars of the war were still deep, and ceremonies like this helped the nation cope with the pain of losing so many loved ones. A South Korean woman tries to comfort another as she cries over the coffin of a loved one. Grief and loss were a devastating reality for many South Korean families, as the conflict caused countless casualties. It is estimated that about 2.5 million civilians lost their lives during the war, and scenes of pain and suffering like this were common throughout the country. Here we see a civilian trapped under the snow, with his hands tied and a small hole for breathing. This cruel act was a common practice of communist forces, who often severely punished civilians considered enemies or sympathizers of the UN troops. The war was marked by brutality against civilians, with summary executions and reprisals occurring during retreats and military advances. Here we see an elderly woman and her grandson wandering among the ruins of their destroyed home after a UN air raid in Pyongyang in 1950. The bombings left North Korea's capital in ruins, with about 75% of the city destroyed over the course of the conflict. Despite the devastating damage, the people of Pyongyang were forced to rebuild their lives amidst the destruction, with many living in underground tunnels or makeshift shelters. Commanders of the 41st Royal British Marines placed demolition charges on the tracks of the enemy supply line. British forces played an important role in the Korean War, carrying out quick and precise attacks that paralyzed the enemy's ability to resupply their troops, especially in remote areas. American forces attacked train cars south of Wonsan in 1950. This action was part of the United States military operations to disrupt the enemy's transportation of supplies and reinforcements. Wonsan, a strategic coastal city, was frequently bombed during the conflict. This type of operation was crucial in weakening the North Korean supply lines, reducing their ability to continue the offensive against UN troops and their allies. American and Korean soldiers stack an enormous amount of empty artillery and mortar shells at a collection point near the front lines on June 18, 1953. This impressive pile of spent ammunition reflects the intensity of the fighting during 4 days of battle for Outpost Harry, a vital strategic point during the war. It is estimated that more than 300,000 rounds were fired during this period. Here we see a soldier carrying an M16M1 cluster adapter in Yokohama, Japan. The adapter, resembling a bomb, will be used to drop 22,500 psychological warfare leaflets over Korea. These leaflets, written in Korean, were part of a strategic campaign to undermine enemy morale and influence the civilian population, encouraging defections and promoting pro-UN messages. An American soldier uses a flamethrower against enemy positions in March 1951. This devastating weapon was employed to clear out bunkers and fortified trenches where North Korean soldiers were hiding. Though feared by the enemy due to its destructive power, flamethrowers also generated fear among their own operators, who often became priority targets because they carried highly flammable fuel tanks on their backs, putting them at great risk during battles. A war-weary Korean girl walks beside a stationary M26 tank in Haengju with her little brother on her back. The image shows us the devastating impact of the conflict on civilians, especially children. Thousands of families were displaced and destroyed, and many children, like this girl, took on heavy responsibilities in caring for their younger siblings amidst the chaos. Marine Captain Francis Fenton reflects on the fate of his men as he is informed that ammunition is running low during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950. With freezing temperatures and surrounded by vastly larger Chinese forces, his troops faced a shortage of ammunition and supplies, making the situation even more critical. Despite these extreme circumstances, the American troops managed to carry out one of the most heroic retreats in military history. A soldier fires a 75mm M20 recoilless rifle during combat. The M20 was a crucial weapon on the front lines, designed to destroy armored vehicles and enemy fortifications, as well as providing heavy support to the infantry. Its portability and lack of significant recoil made it ideal for operations in mountainous and challenging terrains like those in Korea. Children watch as American paratroopers jump near Daegu. The spectacle of the UN forces paratroopers impressed the local civilians, especially the little ones, who closely followed the maneuvers. These paratroopers were essential in infiltration operations, being used in reconnaissance missions and surprise attacks behind enemy lines. Women and children sift through the rubble in Seoul, searching for anything that could be reused or burned as fuel. The devastation caused by the intense fighting in the South Korean capital left many families without basic resources, forcing civilians to search among the debris for items that could help them survive the harsh winter. Warren Austin, the U.S. delegate to the UN Security Council, holds a Russian submachine gun captured by American troops in July 1950. During the session, Austin accused the Soviet Union of supplying weapons to the North Koreans, highlighting the Soviet military support for communist forces. This accusation was part of the growing tensions of the Cold War, a period when the U.S. and its allies sought to contain the expansion of communism, while the Soviet Union supported governments and movements aligned with its ideology. South Korean women trained for the army marched through the streets of Busan on September 12, 1950, ready to join the men in the fight against the Chinese invaders. Busan was the main stronghold of the United Nations forces in Korea, and these women, although not sent to the front lines, played essential support roles such as communication, logistics, and nursing. Their work ensured that UN forces had the necessary support to defend the city. A captured communist is stripped by UN troops in Sariwan in October 1950. This moment occurred during the UN forces' offensive as they rapidly advanced northward after the successful Incheon invasion. UN troops frequently interrogated prisoners of war for crucial information about enemy movements and strategies. U.S. Marines engage in street combat during the liberation of Seoul at the end of September 1950. The battle to retake the South Korean capital was intense, with hand-to-hand combat in the streets and buildings of the city as UN forces fought to expel North Korean troops. Despite the difficulties and enemy resistance, the troops managed to retake Seoul in less than 2 weeks, restoring South Korea's control over its capital. U.S. howitzers in action in Seoul light up the battlefield with the flash of their fire. In addition to being accurate at distant targets, these artillery pieces could fire different types of ammunition, such as fragmentation, high-explosive shells, and smoke munitions for cover. This flexibility allowed combat tactics to be adjusted according to the conditions, making howitzers essential in the war. Crew members are on top of their tank stuck in the bed of the Pukan River, which had overflowed. The tank could not move due to the strong waters and difficult terrain, and was later towed to safety. Complicated terrains, such as rivers and damaged roads, often hindered operations, and recovery vehicles were essential in maintaining the mobility of armored forces, which often determined the success of missions. Explosives destroy a railway bridge on the outskirts of Hamhung in December 1950. The retreating United Nations forces detonated the bridge to prevent the Chinese communists from using it. This action was part of the scorched earth strategy, which destroyed essential infrastructure to hinder the enemy's advance. The retreat from Hamhung was one of the largest maritime evacuations in history, with more than 100,000 soldiers and civilians rescued in operations led by the U.S. Navy. Crew members of a naval rocket battery cover their ears and crouch on the ground as rockets are launched into the night sky. These rocket launchers were used to bombard long-range targets, providing support to ground troops, especially during night offensives. The deafening sounds and the destructive power of the rockets were so intense that soldiers had to protect themselves from the explosion and impact. A family quickly descends the stairs of a building, with the father holding a baby in his arms. On the same street, American tanks fire in response to intense fire from North Korean forces. The scene illustrates the chaos and fear faced by civilians during urban combat. With tanks exchanging fire just a few meters away, this family, like many others, tried to escape the line of fire amid a battle that turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. A group of soldiers from Ohio, known as Leathernecks, pose with their symbolic Christmas present for the North Korean and Chinese communists. During the war, important military operations were carried out even during the harsh winter and holidays like Christmas. The extreme weather conditions, with below-zero temperatures, made combat even more challenging, especially for UN forces. U.S. Navy Private First Class. Luther LaGuire raises the American flag at the U.S. consulate in Seoul in 1950, as UN forces fiercely fought to retake the city. Amidst the fighting around the complex, the act of raising the flag was a symbolic victory for American forces and their allies. Major General Frank Lowe, presidential representative in Korea, examines flash-ranging instruments on the Marine front lines in March 1951. U.S. Marine Sergeant Charles Kitching from Redlands, California, demonstrates how the equipment works. These instruments were used to calculate the distance and location of enemy fire based on the flash of weapons and were critical to American forces. Paratroopers jumped from U.S. Air Force C-119 planes during an operation in 1950. These jumps were part of strategic missions to position troops behind enemy lines or in difficult-to-reach areas. During the war, more than 3,000 paratroopers were deployed in various operations, significantly contributing to the success of military actions in the conflict. Desperate civilians try to escape south, crossing the remains of a destroyed bridge as the North Korean army approaches during the early months of the conflict. Thousands of families were forced to abandon their homes as North Korean forces quickly advanced southward. Crossing destroyed or dangerous bridges was a tragic reality for many, as infrastructure was frequently targeted to disrupt military advances. Here, a 155 mm howitzer is fired during a night attack, illuminating the battlefield with the brightness of the explosion. The 155 mm artillery was one of the most powerful weapons used by American forces, capable of launching projectiles over long distances and causing great destruction to enemy lines. Due to its precision and firepower, This weapon was responsible for nearly 50% of all artillery ammunition fired by U.S. forces during the Korean War. Soldier Donald Jones takes a moment to read a newly placed sign at the southern boundary of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, in Korea on July 30, 1953, just days after the armistice ended the fighting in the war. The sign marks the beginning of the DMZ, a heavily guarded area that separates North Korea and South Korea. This zone was created as part of the ceasefire agreement and remains to this day. Captured American combatants marched down a street in North Korea. Prisoners of war were often used in propaganda parades, a common practice to display the victories of communist forces over UN and US soldiers. About 7,000 American soldiers were captured during the conflict. Many faced extremely harsh conditions in prison camps, suffering mistreatment, starvation, and even political re-education attempts. Marines pay tribute to their fallen comrades at the Division Cemetery in Hamhung in 1950. Hamhung was a strategic point during the war, and the division faced intense fighting in the region. The United States Marine Division suffered around 4,200 casualties during the war, including both dead and wounded. This temporary cemetery was one of many established throughout the war, where soldiers gathered to remember and honor their fallen comrades in battle. 3 Korean communists surrender in a fishing boat off the coast of Korea. During the conflict, capturing communists was a priority for Allied forces, as they supported the North Korean regime and often attempted to infiltrate or escape by sea. These men were likely trying to flee or fulfill some mission, but the Allied forces patrolling the waters to intercept enemy movements arrived first. Here, we see 6 of the 21 American soldiers who refused to return to the United States after the Korean War. They posed beside a truck with a sign that says, "We stay for peace." These soldiers, who had been captured, decided to remain in Communist China after the conflict, citing ideological reasons and the pursuit of peace. This group was the first in American history to refuse repatriation after a conflict. Portraits of Joseph Stalin and North Korean leader Kim Il-sung can be seen near the location where UN troops are under fire. At that time, the alliance between the Soviet Union and North Korea was strongly symbolized by the presence of figures like Stalin in public propaganda and portraits. The Soviet influence in the conflict was significant, providing military and strategic support to North Korean forces. A 16-inch shot from the USS Missouri toward Chongjin is part of the effort to cut North Korean communications. Located only 39 miles from the Chinese border, Chongjin was an important strategic point. The USS Missouri, one of the largest warships of the U.S. Navy, provided naval artillery support with its powerful 16-inch guns. Each shell fired weighed about 2,700 pounds, causing great impact on enemy structures and infrastructure. In this photo, we see a Tachikawa Ki-9, a plane left behind by the Japanese Army after World War II and later reused by the North Koreans. Now, in 1953, the plane is destroyed and being transported on a train car in Kimpo after the end of the Korean War. Lieutenant Larry Mortel, standing beside the aircraft, will conduct a post-combat inspection to ensure the equipment is safe and out of operation. Supply warehouses and port facilities in Wonsan explode after being hit by bombs dropped from 5th Air Force B-26 Invader bombers in 1951. These explosions were part of a series of operations to destabilize supply lines and reduce the enemy's ability to sustain their troops on the front lines. North Korean prisoners of war attend a political re-education course at a UN re-education camp on Kojedo Island, South Korea, in 1952. This camp was established to house captured Chinese and North Korean prisoners. Political re-education was part of an attempt to influence prisoners to abandon their communist ideologies and adopt democratic principles. Soldiers fire a 105 mm howitzer in an indirect fire mission on the Korean battle line near Ulsan in 1950. The 105 mm howitzer was widely used during the conflict for its mobility and versatility, capable of firing projectiles up to a distance of nearly 7 miles. This weapon provided precise fire support to frontline troops, allowing attacks on distant and fortified enemy positions. Men and equipment arrived by parachute in the Korean mountains in 1951 during a UN operation. During the war, operations like these were essential to reinforce ground troops, bringing soldiers and supplies to strategic areas. These airborne landings ensured that troops received the necessary support in difficult-to-access locations, helping to sustain the fight amidst the challenging terrain of Korea. A UN soldier guards the area where prisoners of war are being held, as many captured communist soldiers line up. During the Korean War, more than 130,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners of war were captured by UN forces. Dealing with these prisoners was a major challenge, as many were in re-education camps and faced difficult conditions, while negotiations about how to return them complicated peace efforts. The F-4U Corsairs returned from a combat mission over North Korea and circled the USS Boxer aircraft carrier on September 4, 1951. As they await clearance for the flight deck, the next attack is being prepared. The F-4U Corsair, known for its inverted gull wings, was one of the Navy's most effective fighters, used in both World War II and the Korean War due to its ability to carry large bomb loads and perform various missions. U.S. Army Sergeant Douglas D. Tompkins from the 24th Infantry Division fires a .50 caliber machine gun at communist positions during an attack on the Central East Front of Korea in July 1951. The Browning M2 machine gun, known for its versatility, was used in both ground combat and mounted on vehicles, allowing American forces to repel infantry attacks and destroy light vehicles at long distances. A young officer and his wife sit in silence inside their car on the San Diego dock, California, in 1950. That year, thousands of American military personnel were being sent to the Korean War, which had already displaced more than 1 million people. Families faced the difficult reality of goodbyes, and many officers, like the one in the photo, left behind wives and children, not knowing when or if they would return. United Nations Re-Education Camp for Chinese and North Korean prisoners on Kojedo Island, 1952. The site housed combatants captured during the war, where prisoners went through re-education programs to change their political loyalties. The atmosphere in the camps was often tense, with divisions among the prisoners between those who wanted to be repatriated and those who preferred to defect to the opposite side. Korean refugees carry their belongings as they flee southward in mid-1950. With the escalation of the conflict and the invasion of North Korean forces, thousands of civilians were forced to abandon their homes, seeking safety far from the combat zones. This mass exodus was one of the largest humanitarian crises of the conflict, with more than 1 million people displaced during the first months of the war. Here we see the destruction in a residential area of Seoul in October 1950. In the background to the right stands the Capitol building, surrounded by ruins and debris. Seoul was one of the main battlegrounds, changing hands several times during the conflict. The city suffered enormous damage, with entire neighborhoods destroyed by bombings and intense fighting. Refugees crowd the railroad depot in Incheon, desperately awaiting a chance to board a train to the south, seeking safety from the advancing communist hordes. As North Korean and Chinese forces advanced, many civilians fled to escape the violence. Overcrowding at train stations and ports was common, and the journey away from the front lines was the only hope for many who had lost their homes and families during the conflict. A Panther fighter jet prepares to take off from a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, embarking on an attack mission against a military target in North Korea. On July 3 and 4, 1950, a combined fleet of American and British aircraft carriers carried out a series of strategic airstrikes against North Korean military installations, marking one of the first coordinated naval offensives of the war. U.S. Far East Air Force's planes drop a large number of bombs on a military target in North Korea. Bombings like this were essential in weakening enemy forces, with the United States dropping about 700,000 tons of bombs during the conflict. Air operations primarily aimed to destroy supply lines, military infrastructure, and logistics centers of the Chinese and North Korean communists, who suffered approximately 1 million casualties, including many civilians, due to these intense air campaigns. North Korean refugees crowd the port of Hungnam on December 19, 1950, using any available vessel to escape the city. Fishing boats filled with people and goods, along with a packed ship deck, illustrate the chaos and desperation of the population fleeing the advance of communist troops. In the evacuation of Hungnam, known as the Miracle of Hungnam, About 98,000 civilians and 100,000 soldiers were rescued in the final weeks of 1950. Tank landing ships unload in Incheon in September 1950. American forces landed at the port of Incheon one day after the start of the Battle of Incheon, one of the most daring and decisive amphibious operations of the war. Planned by General Douglas MacArthur, the invasion aimed to cut North Korean supply lines and reclaim control of Seoul. Soldiers watched joyfully as singer Elton Britt performs during a variety show in Hongcheon, Korea. The event provided a break from the tensions of war, bringing a rare moment of relaxation to the troops. Shows like this were organized to boost soldier morale, offering entertainment and a connection to normal life amid the conflict. Marilyn Monroe sings for U.S. Marines in 1954 after the Korean War. Her visit was part of a United Service Organizations tour, where she performed 10 shows in 4 days to boost troop morale. Marilyn's presence, one of the biggest stars of the time, had a significant impact on the soldiers, who described the experience as one of the best moments of their time in Korea. She even stated that the tour was the best thing that ever happened in her life. Major General Blackshear M. Bryan, on the left, exchanges credentials with Communist Lieutenant General Lee Sang-cho at the opening session of the Military Armistice Commission in Panmunjom on July 27, 1953. This historic meeting marked the official end of hostilities, with the armistice agreement signed on that same day. Panmunjom became a symbolic location where the truce was negotiated after 3 years of intense fighting. However, a peace treaty was never formally signed, which means that the Koreas technically remain at war to this day. 3 pilots from the 18th Fighter Bomber Wing celebrate the signing of the armistice. They had just returned from a combat mission in North Korea when they learned of the end of hostilities. These pilots, who risked their lives on dangerous missions, could now finally breathe a sigh of relief with the imminent end of the conflict. Headlines at a newsstand in New York's Grand Central Station in November 1950 highlight the imminent threat of atomic retaliation. At that moment, global tensions were high, with the possibility that the conflict could escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. American forces, facing the advance of North Korean and Chinese troops, considered drastic measures, including the use of atomic bombs, a frightening reminder only 5 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Jacob A. Malik, the Soviet representative to the UN Security Council, raises his hand to cast the only vote against the resolution calling for the withdrawal of Chinese Communist troops from Korea. The session, held in New York in December 1950, took place during a critical moment in the Korean Peninsula conflict. While most council members supported the withdrawal, Malik voted against it, demonstrating the Soviet Union's alignment with the interests of China and North Korea. Dwight Eisenhower, newly elected President of the United States, waves his hat alongside his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, as they are greeted by the public. He assumed the presidency succeeding Harry Truman and brought the promise of ending the Korean War. With a firm stance, Eisenhower informed communist forces that he was willing to use nuclear weapons if necessary to end the conflict. His strategy of pressure accelerated peace negotiations, leading to the signing of the armistice. Crowds gather in Seoul to greet Chinese ex-prisoners of war before their flight to Formosa, now Taiwan, as part of Operation Comeback, where thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners of war were released after renouncing communism in exchange for freedom. This moment captured the relief and hope of many who chose not to return to their home countries controlled by the communist regime. Troops from the Korean Liberation Army, KLA, capturing Japanese soldiers in Taihongdan during the Korean War. Japanese soldiers lined up in preparation to execute Korean prisoners during the Korean War. The execution of prisoners was a common practice in violent conflicts like this, especially involving occupying forces and resistance movements.